Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. So, inshallah, in today's class, we are actually going to conclude the section of Tahara in the Matn of Abi Shuja' radiallahu anhu. We will talk about what for many people might be considered a difficult subject to understand. We are going to talk about the menstrual cycle, the monthly menstrual cycle of women, and postnatal bleeding. So almost everything we are going to discuss in today's lecture are specific to women, except at the very end when we talk about the things impermissible for people that are in a state of janaba, which is for both men and women, and for people that are in a state of hadath, which also is for both men and women. But the majority of the lecture will be about the menstrual cycle. When we learn about the menstrual cycle, we will learn that the Sharia identifies three types of bloods that come out of the vagina for the woman. One is the menstrual cycle, which will be defined in a specific way. Number two is postnatal bleeding, which is the blood that happens after birth. And number three is everything else, what is called istihala. So actually, if you understand those three categories, it will be easy to understand all of the rules, because whenever there's an irregularity, we put that in the bucket of other, istihala. As I've said before, Sharia is a precise instrument, so we will give definitions to all of these things. We will also talk about the minimum time and the maximum time, keeping in mind that all of the timings of the Sharia are all lunar time. So when we talk about the year and the weeks and the months and so on and so forth, we're talking about the lunar calendar. We will also talk about the minimum age for menstruation, which will define a young girl from a young woman. And we will also talk about issues related to pregnancy and the length of pregnancy. Following that, as I mentioned, we will also then talk about things that are unlawful to do when you are in a state of janaba. Now, this would be women who are in their monthly cycle, or men and women who are in a state of janaba because of intercourse or emission of sexual fluid, etc. Whenever you are in that state, there are certain things that you cannot do until you lift that state. And then we will also talk about the things that are unlawful to do when you are in the state of hadath, the state of minor ritual impurity. You go to the bathroom or stuff like that. There are a few things that you can't do until you remove that state. In the discussion of these do's and don'ts, we will also talk about certain things related to the mosque, understanding the Quran. And again, the mosque will then have to be defined. The Quran will have to be defined in their specific definitions to make sense of all of these things, inshallah. And then this will conclude the chapter of purification. So let us begin by reading the Arabic text. قال المصنف رحمه الله ونفعنا بعلومه في الدارين آمين. فصل في بيان أحكام الحيض والنفاس والاستحاضة. ويخرج من الفرج ثلاثة دماء: دم الحيض والنفاس والاستحاضة. فالحيض هو الخارج من فرج المرأة على سبيل الصحة من غير سبب الولادة، ولونه أسود محتدم لذاع. والنفاس هو الخارج عقب الولادة. والاستحاضة هو الخارج في غير أيام الحيض والنفاس. وأقل الحيض يوم وليلة، وأكثره 15 يوما، وغالبه 6 أو 7. وأقل النفاس لحظة، وأكثره 60 يوما، وغالبه 40 يوما. وأقل الطهر بين الحيضتين 15 يوما، ولا حد لأكثره. وأقل زمن تحيض فيه المرأة 9 سنين. وأقل الحمل 6 أشهر، وأكثره 4 سنين، وغالبه 9 أشهر. ويحرم بالحيض والنفاس 8 أشياء: الصلاة والصوم، وقراءة القرآن، ومسح المصحف وحمله، ودخول المسجد، والطواف والوطء، والاستمتاع بما بين السرة والركبة. ويحرم على الجنب 5 أشياء: الصلاة وقراءة القرآن، ومسح المصحف، وحمله والطواف واللبث في المسجد ويحرم على المحدث ثلاثة أشياء الصلاة والطواف ومسح المصحف وحمله. That is the Arabic that we will cover, inshallah, which will take us to the conclusion of the book. Now let us read a quick translation of what we just read. Sorry, I lost my page on the book. Okay, here we go. Menstruation and postnatal bleeding. 3 types of blood exit from the vagina. So again, this is for the time being, the discussion is specific to women. Menstrual, postnatal, and irregular. Menstrual blood is blood that normally exits from a woman's vagina, and without being caused by delivery, it is black in color, hot, and pungent. Postnatal bleeding is the blood that exits after childbirth. Irregular bleeding, istihada, is blood that exits outside of the days of menstrual and postnatal bleeding. The minimum duration of menstruation is 24 hours. The maximum duration is 15 days. The average duration is 6 to 7 days. The minimum duration for postnatal bleeding is a single instant. Its maximum is 60 days. The most average duration is 40 days. The minimum duration of purity between 2 menstrual cycles is 15 days, and it has no maximum limit. The minimum age at which a woman menstruates is 9 lunar years. The minimum duration for pregnancy is 6 months. The maximum is 4 years. The most common duration is 9 months. Actions unlawful without ritual purity. 8 things are unlawful because of menstruation and postnatal bleeding: prayer and fasting, reciting the Quran, touching and carrying the Quran, entering the mosque, circumambulating the Kaaba, the tawaf, intercourse, and lastly seeking sexual enjoyment from the area between the woman's navel and the knees. 5 things are unlawful for someone in the state of major ritual impurity: prayer, reciting the Quran, touching and carrying the Quran, circumambulating the Kaaba, and remaining within the mosque. 3 things are unlawful for someone in the state of minor ritual impurity: the hadath, prayer, tawaf, circumambulating the Kaaba, and touching and holding the Quran. So it's quite a bit of things that we will need to discuss. So in regards to the section Sayyida Aisha alayhi salam narrates, as is recorded in Bukhari, that the women went out seeking the Hajj. So when they approached near the Mecca area, they got their monthly cycle. So the Prophet ﷺ entered upon me and I was crying. She was crying because she got her period. So the Prophet ﷺ says, "What's wrong? Do you have your monthly cycle?" And she said, "Yes." And he said, "Inna هذا أمر كتبه الله على بنات آدم فقط ما يقضي الحاج غير أن لا تطوفي بالبيت." So the Prophet ﷺ said, comforting her, said, "This is something that Allah has prescribed upon women. This is part of the human condition. Do everything that the Hajj person does, except do not do the tawaf." So in this hadith, this also gives us something else, which is not necessarily directly part of the class, but something also to remember, that this is a natural condition. And sometimes women become very upset because they're left out of certain days of fasting. They want to go on an Umrah trip or a Hajj trip. And this hadith is very important that it came this way, because Sayyidah Aisha herself, alayhi salam, was very, very upset. But the Prophet ﷺ sought to comfort her, to say, "Look, you didn't do anything wrong." He's saying, meaning you didn't do anything wrong. This is something natural, but there are things that you can do, and then there are just certain things that you can't do, but your reward is still with you. So, regarding the irregular bleeding, Sayyida Aisha also narrates, as is in Bukhari, that Fatima, the daughter of Abi Hubaysh, radiallahu anhu, came to the Prophet ﷺ, and she said, Ya Rasulullah, inni imra'atun ustahadu fala athur. She's like, I am a woman that has a lot of irregular bleeding, and I can't remain in the state of purity. To which the Prophet ﷺ said, he said, لا إنما ذلك عرق وليس بالحيضة. He said, this bleeding that you have is not from the blood of the womb, but it is another type of blood that comes from the woman's body. And this is the differentiation that the Sharia has between, forget about postnatal bleeding for a second, because that only is about birth. But when it comes to defining the menstrual cycle, as we will talk about, anything out of the definition of the menstrual cycle, the Sharia says istihada. What the Prophet ﷺ is saying here is more specific, which is to say, this is another type of blood. It's not the blood that comes from the womb, but there's an irq, there's another vein inside the body that is issuing that blood, and therefore it is considered irregular blood. So the menstrual cycle and the postnatal bleeding is a special type of bleeding that happens from the vagina that requires a special set of rules. But outside of those rules, the irregular blood, we will see in the next couple clips how the woman is to deal with them. See if there's any other hadith I want to. The Prophet ﷺ also said, as is narrated by Ibn Umar, that the person that's in state in janaba and the person who is the woman who has her period, لا يقرأ شيئا من القرآن. This is narrated by Tirmidhi, not to read anything from the Quran. Again, when we get to back to the text, we'll talk about exactly what that means, because those are precisely defined things. Another hadith that the Prophet ﷺ said is that the woman should not لا أحل المسجد لحائض ولا لجنب. That the masjid is not a place for a person who's in a state of janaba or in a state of period menstruation for a woman to remain in the masjid. Again, as we will come to define them specifically, because these are things that have specific definitions. A man came to the Prophet ﷺ and asked, what can he enjoy intimately from his wife when she has her period? He said, you have what is above the izar, what is above the covering of the private areas. What izar is the waist wrapper, as we will come to see. So this will be important as we come to define some of the intimacy that is permissible. So inshallah, in the next clip, we will actually begin talking about the text. Okay, so going back to our text, there are three types of blood that exit from the vagina: menstrual, postnatal, and irregular. So let us define them so we understand what it is we're talking about. Menstrual blood is blood that normally exits from a woman's vagina and without being caused by delivery. Because in the birth process, there can be blood that comes out, and there are some fuqaha that say a woman who is pregnant can have her menstrual cycle. So the reason it's worded this way, without being caused by delivery, to differentiate it between the postnatal bleeding. Its color is black, hot, and pungent. Now, when it comes to the color and the texture of the menses, this is something that can change. It's not necessary, I won't say it's subjective, but it's definitely something that there's a lot can be written about it. This is just an introductory book. In some of the longer books, they'll talk about hundreds of different colors. And now, with all of the tones of colors that we have thousands of colors. So this is ghaliban. Usually it looks something like this. This also tells us that the fuqaha were people that really cared about the details of things, as maybe disgusting as some of this might seem to somebody, but this is part of the job of the faqih, is to be able to define everything. So they have its color, they know that it has a certain type of temperature, they know that it has a certain type of smell that's not pleasant, etc. And in that way, they can tell if somebody has a question in the future, is this menses, is this not menses, they will know, well, that's not usually what it looks like, smells like, etc. So this is ghaliban. usually. Okay, so that's the menstrual cycle. As for postnatal bleeding, it is blood that exits after the childbirth. So after the child is born, whether it's one baby or two babies or more in one womb, after that process, there is usually a type of bleeding that takes place afterwards, and that is called postnatal bleeding and nifas. Okay, and then there's everything else, which is istihada. If it doesn't fall into these definitions, then it's considered irregular bleeding. Irregular bleeding is blood that exits outside of the days of menstrual and postnatal bleeding. So, what is the special ruling of the istihada? Let's talk about that now before we talk about the other stuff. If a woman experiences istihada, as we will come to define it, then it's considered irregular bleeding. She makes one ghusl, she cleans herself and makes wudu for each prayer, just like the tayammum person would. So every fard prayer, she would make sure that she's clean, make a wudu after the adhan has come in, and pray that prayer. Why? Because that blood is not, as we read in the hadith, that blood is not considered the blood of the menses, but it's considered another type of blood. So anything that we are going to read now about the minimum days and the maximum days, anything that falls outside of that is categorized as istihada. What does the woman who's experiencing istihada have to do? Make one ghusl, clean herself, her private area, make sure that there's no blood that's dripping anywhere, etc. I mean, as she normally would, of course, and then make wudu for each prayer until that istihada period ends. So she takes the ruling as the person who has salas al-bawl, the person who is incontinent or has the constant state of hadath that is uncontrollable. Okay. Also, the istihada person can fast. So if a woman enters into the state of istihada, not only can she pray, but she can also fast, inshallah. Okay. The minimum duration for the menstruation is 24 hours. The maximum is 15 days. The average is 6 to 7 days. The average is, every woman has their own average and every time and place. So don't worry about the average. Let's focus on the minimum and the maximum. The minimum is 24 days. So if a woman starts spotting now, she has to wait a minimum of 24 hours to ensure that there's no more bleeding. Sometimes a woman spots, and then several hours go by, maybe 20 hours go by, and she feels like, I'm done. Not until the 24-hour period has ceased. But the maximum is 15 days. So if a woman starts spotting now, and 30 hours later there's no blood, she thinks, okay, I finished my period. She washes and she prays, and then she finds blood. She's going to connect the sighting of blood now with that first sighting. Now the span between these two times is still within 15 days, so she is in a state of menstruation. There's no sin for praying because she assumed that she was done, of course, but it's important to remember these rules. If she gets to 15 days and 1 minute and there's still bleeding, then we know that we've finished the period and we've entered into the state of istihada. Now, the minimum duration for postnatal bleeding is a single instant after the birth is done, whether it's one child, two child, three child, whatever, however many, usually it's one child in the womb. After that, there could be a burst of or a little bit of exiting of blood. That could be the minimum amount of nifas. However, the maximum amount is 60 days and the average is 40. So again, if a woman has postnatal bleeding 60 days and then 1 moment more than that, she has finished her nifas and then she has entered into the state of istihada. That's why it's very important to understand istihada as just sort of, everything else. Okay. The minimum age at which a woman menstruates is 9 lunar years. So, if a young girl before 9 lunar years, again, the lunar calendar is the calendar that we're looking at. If a young girl shows bleeding before 9 lunar years, what do we call it? Istihada. Because it's irregular. That's why I said istihada, just think about it as you can throw everything else that's irregular in that category. So if a young girl comes and she shows that she's bleeding before 9 lunar years, then we say that this is istihada blood. It's not menstruation. Once she starts 9 lunar years and then more, any blood that would come, we start to put it in our categories of minimum days, maximum days, and so on and so forth. And then he ends this section with the age of pregnancy, which is a little bizarre. So we'll talk about that for a little bit. And he says the minimum duration of pregnancy is 6 months, and the maximum is 4 years. The most common is 9 months. Of course, when he talks about months here, he's talking about lunar months. Now, there are some narrations by Imam Shafi'i and Imam Malik. I think that maybe Imam Shafi'i himself was in his mother's womb for 4 years, or it was Imam Malik. I can't remember exactly the narration off the top of my head right now. But there are some traditions like that. And it was a sign of purity or piety, etc. Obviously, that's probably in our lifetime we will never experience or see anything like that. But it's helpful that there is a tradition that's linked to it, so we have it listed in our, annals of Islamic law. Maybe at some point there will be a court situation in which a woman is pregnant and her husband dies and she gives birth several years later, 3 years later. She's being accused of, al-fahisha, she's being accused of adultery, even though she's like living remote all by herself. And then the Qadi will remember, I know in the books of the Shafi'i madhab it is recorded that the maximum duration could be 4 years, so we will have ilhaq and we will have this child be not a child of zina. So maybe there's a use for this type of tool or this type of legal argument in the future. Ghaliban, usually that's not going to be the case. Usually it's going to be 9 months, and in modern medicine, we follow the trimester schedule. But it's important to remember that it could be premature. It could be 6 months. These things will become important not in the section of purity necessarily, but as I was alluding to earlier, in the sections of courts in which we can establish nasab or not establish nasab. Because for us, adultery is a kabira. Allah Ta'ala protect us. And the child of zina cannot have the nasab to the father. So sometimes these rulings, knowing the minimum and the maximum of the of the pregnancy, can help the qadi, even if they're not a Shafi'i qadi, because right now we are studying law according to one madhab. But when we come to qada and fatwa and things like that, we have to look at the whole toolkit, all of the things that we have. So maybe the qadi in the future is not a Shafi'i, but he will know that in the Shafi'i madhab we have this documented. And this might be a way to save families and to save paternity and to save the nasab and the lineage. Based on that will also be inheritance laws. Based on that will be relations, who's related to who, and things like that. But the most common is 9 months. When it comes to things that are determined by medicine, average period, when a woman starts her period, other than the 9 years, when a woman stops her period and enters menopause, pregnancies, things like that, Imam Shafi'i says we look at science, we look at medicine. These are the things. The medicine meaning we observe what has happened around us, and we take those statistics, and that informs the faqih of what is usually the case. Other than like the 9 lunar years as the minimum period, other than that, everything else we would very much welcome these medical statistics. And in bodies of fiqh and in sharia courts, it's very common to have experts from these different fields to help opine on these things. Okay, and in this final clip, let us turn to the final pages of the chapter. Actions that are unlawful without ritual purity. So, after all of this discussion of purity, let us look at the things that we cannot do when we are in these states until those states are lifted. 8 things are unlawful due to menstruation and postnatal bleeding, again, as defined with the days. So here we're talking about the hayd and the nifas, we're not talking about istihada. Number 1 is that there's a prayer. So the woman who is during her menstrual cycle, monthly cycle, and is in a state of postnatal bleeding, it is haram for her to pray. Whether it is a fard prayer or whether it is a nafil prayer, it is haram for her to pray. So she would incur a sin if she prayed. In addition to that, there is no making up of those prayers that she missed. And then number 2 is fasting. It is haram for a woman who is experiencing her monthly cycle or in a state of nifas, postnatal bleeding, to fast, whether it be a fard fast, making up of a fard fast, or a sunnah fast, it is haram. And if the days of fast that she's missing fall during the month of Ramadan, those days are days that she would make up when she is not in that state anymore. Number 3 is reciting the Quran. Reciting the Quran means to recite out loud the verses of the Quran with the intention that they are Quran. So it is to stand here and say, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, etc. That's what reciting the Quran means. But if I were to say the Quran in my mind silently, that is not considered reciting the Quran. Or if I am doing a dhikr, and in the dhikr are verses of the Quran, but I'm reciting those verses with the intention that they are dhikr, not with the intention that they are Quran, that's okay. So a woman who has her monthly cycle or is in a state of postnatal bleeding, she can do all of her adhkar, all of her awrad, nothing will prevent her from that. Number 4 is touching and carrying the Quran or the Mus'haf. The Mus'haf, again, is something that is specifically defined as every surah in the Quran from the Fatiha to the Nas written in the Uthmanic script between two covers. That is the technical definition of the Mus'haf. So, if I were to have a book that had 1 or 2 juz of the Quran, that would not be considered the Mus'haf. If the Quran was written in other than the Uthmanic script, in another type of script, that would not be considered the Mus'haf. If it was a book of tafsir in which there was a couple verses on the top and then tafsir on the bottom, that would not be considered the Mus'haf. But the Mus'haf is the Mus'haf. All of the surahs from Al-Fatiha to Nas in one volume written in the Uthmanic script. So, if a woman has her monthly cycle or is in a state of postnatal bleeding, she will not be able to touch or carry the Quran. Only exception to something like this is if, it's in her purse or her school bag or something, and she's out and about, and then she gets her period at that moment. Well, she has no choice. She has to carry it because leaving it could cause the Quran to be dirtied or lost or stolen or something like that. So that would be an exception. Here he's talking more about I'm in a state of menstruation or postnatal bleeding, and I'm going to go grab the Mus'haf and put it in my bag. That's not what you're going to do. But if you used your device, your phone or a tablet, that's not considered the Mus'haf. So if you had the app, for example, of a Quran app, and you were skipping through the app because you wanted to remember a verse that you were reciting to yourself silently, that would be something that's permissible. Entering the mosque. Entering and remaining in a mosque. Again, a mosque is something that is specifically defined as from its waqf document. That this is a masjid lillah, a mosque for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Not included in the mosque are zawiyas or schoolhouses that have, like the Azhar, for example. Even though we call it the Azhar mosque, it's not a mosque from its waqf document, it's a school. That's why many of our classes were in the Azhar, because women can attend all the time. There's no prohibition for them attending. So when you want to look at the place that you're going, the books will say, Sufi zawiyas and rawabit and schoolhouses, these places are not considered masjid. The masjid is a structure that is built specifically for the purpose of the 5 daily prayers, and in its waqf document it's designated as a mosque. Other than that, it's not a mosque, which is why many people in Muslim minority communities would do well for themselves to reconsider how they establish their Islamic centers to make them more wide, in their founding documents, so as not to prevent women from coming to those spaces. Circumambulating around the Kaaba, doing the tawaf, we read that hadith that the Prophet ﷺ prohibited that, so that's not doable when you're in this state. Of course, sexual intercourse is not possible while the woman is in a state of her monthly cycle or postnatal bleeding. And then lastly, seeking sexual enjoyment from the area between the woman's navel and the knees uncovered. So Imam al-Nawawi radiallahu anhu in the Majmu'ah, and Imam al-Nawawi, as we know, is the main filter, the main murajjah of the madhab. He said that as long as the woman's navel to her knees or that area, basically her private areas are covered, there can be sexual enjoyment or intimacy can be sought as long as it's on top of that. So there's a lot of liberality in that specific ruling. Okay, so these 8 things are the things that are specific to the woman when she has her menstrual cycle or her postnatal bleeding. not when she is istihada. And then he says there are 5 things unlawful for someone in the state of janaba. So this would be for both men and women. Because while the menstrual cycle and the postnatal bleeding is a type of janaba for the woman, there are other types of janaba that a woman can be in that is also shared with a man. So if you are in a state of janaba, you cannot pray until you make your ghusl. You cannot recite the Quran until you make your ghusl, again the way we defined it. You cannot touch and carry the Quran as we defined it. You cannot do the Kaaba, you cannot do the circumambulation around the Kaaba, you can't do your tawaf, and you can't remain within the mosque. Remain in the mosque, I mean you could pass through the mosque but not remain. Illa abir sabil, the Quran says. So you can pass through the mosque but not to remain in it. So these types of prohibitions are things for the person who's in a state of janaba, but they can easily be lifted by simply making the ghusl, or if you do not have the water to make your tayammum, to be able to temporarily do that. When it comes to the Quran, again, this is something that one needs to be careful with, because especially if you're a student and you are memorizing the Quran or learning the Quran, this might be an area where you would want to take another opinion from another madhab that's a little bit more liberal, so that you don't have a inqita, you don't have a distance between you and the Quran. But as far as the inherited fiqh that we have, this is how it is in the madhab. And then lastly, he says 3 things are unlawful for someone who has the hadath. So somebody who just loses their wudu. You pray. You cannot pray until you make wudu, unless there's no water and you're making tayammum. We talked about that. You cannot do tawaf around the Kaaba if you do not have wudu. So the tawaf requires tahara, unlike the sa'i. The sa'i between the Safa and Marwa does not require tahara. As a matter of fact, nothing else in the Umrah or the Hajj requires tahara except for the tawaf, because the tawaf is the rite of the greeting of the haram. It's instead of praying 2 rak'ahs to greet the haram, you do the 7 tawaf. It's one of the khasa'is of al-Haram al-Sharif in Mecca. May Allah Ta'ala allow us to visit it soon. And then touching and holding the Quran, again, there's a difference of opinion. In the Zahiri madhab, the Zahiris allow one to touch the Quran and to read from the Quran if they do not have wudu. Usually, and I try my best in these classes not to talk about other madhahib or dispensations, because we want to stick with the fiqh, but this is one of those cases where it's important to mention. Usually Quran teachers will encourage their students to follow that other opinion while they are memorizing the Quran, and the Quran is a part of their daily life and they need access to it and they have to carry it and things like that. It becomes important. But in the traditional fiqh, in the traditional inherited Shafi'i fiqh, we are not allowed to touch the Quran or move it or carry it unless we have wudu as a way of honoring it. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. This then concludes the chapter of purity, of purification, tahara. In the next class, inshallah, next lecture, we will enter into the next chapter of fiqh, which is the chapter of prayer. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. So, in today's lecture, we were able to conclude, alhamdulillah, the chapter of tahara, which is the first chapter of the book of Abi Shuja' radiallahu anhu. And already in just this one chapter, so many points of fiqh and so many definitions and so many terms that hopefully will guide us throughout the rest of our journey as we learn all the other chapters of Islamic law. In the concluding lecture, we focused mainly on the situation that is specific to women, their monthly menstrual cycle, as well as postnatal bleeding. And we learned that both the monthly menstrual cycle for the woman and postnatal bleeding are some things that are specifically defined with specific age, specific minimum and maximum times. Anything that falls outside of that, the Sharia deems it to be irregular bleeding or istihada. Following that, we learned what are the do's and don'ts for a woman who has her menstrual cycle or postnatal bleeding. Likewise, we talked about what a woman can do and how she can resume her devotional religious life when she is in the state of istihada, which can happen outside of the defined times. about the menstruation and the postnatal bleeding. We learned about the minimal times for the monthly cycle and maximum times. And we learned that we would do istishab, that we would connect the showing of blood that a woman experiences to determine whether we are within the minimum 24 hours or the maximum 15 days. And then therefore we would know if we are in a regular period cycle or we have entered into the irregular experience. And the same thing with the nifas, the postnatal bleeding. We talked a little bit about the minimum age of menstruation being 9 lunar years, and then we talked about some of the fiqh that is regarding pregnancy and how, as bizarre as some of it sounds, there might be some utilities in other sections of the fiqh chapters regarding them, but how it's important that we take these statistics, or we take these maximum and minimums from statistical evidence that we find through the medical literature, and how that is an integral part and an integral tool for the faqih. And then concluding the chapter, we learned about the things that a woman who is in the state of her menstrual cycle and postnatal bleeding cannot do. What are the things that she cannot engage in? And then we looked at the things that the person in the state of major ritual impurity, janaba, which can be shared by both men and women, can do, and how they can easily be lifted with the ghusl. As far as the hayd and the nifas, those need to be lifted by the passage of time, the cessation of the blood, followed by the ghusl. And then lastly, we looked at what a person who is in a state of hadath, or minor ritual impurity, cannot do. And I told you about some dispensations that one might consider, specifically in regards to the mushaf. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.